In the dead of night, when most people sleep peacefully in their beds, some warriors carry burdens that would crush ordinary souls. This is the story of Lieutenant Sarah Chen, a brilliant military intelligence officer whose dedication to truth cost her everything she had worked for. It's about a colonel who thought he could bury the truth with public humiliation. But, most importantly, it's about a SEAL unit whose darkest secrets would eventually surface, changing everything. What happens when the person trying to expose corruption becomes the target? What happens when doing the right thing makes you the enemy? And, what happens when the truth is so explosive that it threatens to shake the very foundation of military command? This is not just another military story. This is about courage in its purest form, the courage to stand alone against overwhelming odds, even when it means sacrificing your career, your reputation, and everything you've built. It's about the price of integrity and the power of persistence. The truth always has a way of coming out. Sometimes it takes months. Sometimes it takes years. But, when it finally emerges, it changes everything for everyone involved. This is that story. Lieutenant Sarah Chen stood at attention in the sterile conference room, her hands clasped behind her back, watching as Colonel Marcus Webb shuffled through a stack of papers with deliberate slowness. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the room where her military career was about to be dismantled piece by piece. She had known this moment would come. For 3 weeks, she had felt the walls closing in around her, ever since she submitted that report about the SEAL unit's activities in Afghanistan. The report that was supposed to remain classified. The report that was supposed to protect American lives and preserve military integrity. Instead, it had painted a target on her back. Colonel Webb finally looked up, his steel gray eyes cold and calculating. He was a man who had climbed the military ranks through political maneuvering rather than battlefield heroics, and Sarah had made the mistake of threatening his carefully constructed world. "Lieutenant Chen," he began, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "You stand accused of conduct unbecoming an officer, insubordination, and unauthorized disclosure of classified information." The words hit her like physical blows, but Sarah kept her expression neutral. She had been expecting this. What she hadn't expected was the presence of the base's public affairs officer, Captain Rodriguez, who sat in the corner with a camera crew. This wasn't just a disciplinary hearing. This was a show. "Sir, I submitted a routine intelligence report through proper channels," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her chest. "Everything I documented was within my authorized scope of duties." Colonel Webb's lips curved into a thin smile. "Routine? You call accusations against one of our most elite SEAL units routine?" He picked up a folder and opened it slowly. "According to this report, you claim that SEAL Team 6 conducted unauthorized operations, engaged in civilian targeting, and covered up war crimes. These are serious allegations, Lieutenant. They're serious because what I witnessed was serious, sir." The colonel's face darkened. "What you witnessed? Or what you think you witnessed?" "Because according to multiple testimonies from decorated Navy SEALs, including Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison and his team, you were never present during any of their operations. They state that you have a history of making false accusations and seeking attention through dramatic claims." Sarah felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. She knew Jake Morrison well, too well. They had served together in Afghanistan, and she had trusted him with information that could end both their careers. Information about what really happened during Operation Silent Thunder. "Sir, Lieutenant Commander Morrison is lying," she said, the words coming out more forcefully than she intended. "I was present during the briefing on March 15 when he discussed targeting civilian infrastructure. I have documentation of conversations where he explicitly discussed eliminating witnesses to cover up collateral damage." Colonel Webb stood up, his 6-foot frame looming over the conference table. "Documentation that conveniently disappeared from your files? Documentation that no one else can verify?" He gestured to the camera crew. "This is exactly the kind of attention-seeking behavior that has concerned your superior officers, Lieutenant Chen." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. Her files hadn't just disappeared, they had been stolen from her secure locker 3 days after she submitted her report. Someone with high-level access had removed every piece of evidence she had carefully collected over 6 months. The truth is, Lieutenant, Colonel Webb continued, now pacing behind his chair like a predator circling wounded prey, you have a documented history of psychological instability. You've been seeing the base psychiatrist for anxiety and depression. You've made previous complaints against male colleagues that were deemed unfounded. And, now, faced with the possibility of an unsuccessful fitness report, you've concocted this elaborate fantasy to deflect attention from your own shortcomings. The accusation hit Sarah like a slap across the face. Yes, she had sought counseling after what she witnessed in Afghanistan. Yes, she had filed complaints about harassment that were mysteriously dismissed. But, connecting those dots to paint her as unstable was a masterpiece of character assassination. Furthermore, the colonel said, his voice rising for the benefit of the cameras, your reckless accusations have put American lives at risk. SEAL Team 6 has been compromised because of your irresponsible behavior. Their families have received death threats. Their operations have been jeopardized. Your selfishness has potentially cost American lives. Sarah felt something break inside her chest. She thought about Jake Morrison's wife, Amanda, and their 2 young children. She thought about the other team members who had become like brothers to her during their deployment. She had never wanted to hurt them. She had only wanted to stop what she knew was wrong. I understand your concerns, sir, she said quietly, but the evidence I collected clearly shows what? Colonel Webb slammed his hand on the table, making everyone in the room jump. Shows that a junior officer with documented mental health issues has made wild accusations against war heroes? Shows that someone who couldn't handle the pressure of combat operations has decided to destroy the reputations of better soldiers to make herself feel important? The camera crew captured every word, every gesture. Sarah realized this wasn't just about destroying her career, this was about creating a narrative that would discredit anything she might say in the future. They weren't just removing her from service, they were making sure no one would ever believe her again. Captain Rodriguez stepped forward with a prepared statement. The United States Army takes all allegations seriously, but we also protect our service members from false accusations. Lieutenant Chen's claims have been thoroughly investigated and found to be without merit. Her behavior represents a betrayal of the trust placed in her by the American people and her fellow soldiers. Sarah looked around the room at the faces staring back at her. Some showed disgust, others pity. None showed belief. In that moment, she understood the full scope of what was happening. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about sending a message to anyone else who might be thinking about speaking out. Lieutenant Chen, Colonel Webb said, his voice now carrying a tone of fake sympathy, I'm recommending you for immediate psychiatric evaluation and administrative discharge. Your service record will reflect conduct unbecoming an officer. Any benefits you might have been entitled to will be reviewed and, likely, revoked. The words echoed in the sterile room like a death sentence. Sarah had dedicated 8 years of her life to the military. She had sacrificed relationships, missed family gatherings, and put her body and mind through hell in service to her country. Now it was all being stripped away because she had tried to do the right thing. But, as she looked at Colonel Webb's satisfied expression, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She wasn't going to disappear quietly. She wasn't going to let them bury the truth with her career. Sir, she said, her voice clear and strong, I request a formal court-martial. I want my accusations heard by a jury of my peers, with full discovery of all evidence, including the missing files from my locker. Colonel Webb's face went pale. A court-martial would mean lawyers, investigations, and public scrutiny he couldn't control. It would mean witnesses under oath and evidence that couldn't be conveniently lost. That's your right, he said slowly, but I should warn you that the penalties for false accusations in a court-martial are much more severe than administrative discharge. You could face criminal charges. I understand, sir. But I also understand that in a court-martial, the truth has a way of coming out. As Sarah was escorted from the room, she caught sight of herself in the reflection of the conference room window. She looked small and isolated, a single figure standing against an institution designed to crush dissent. But her eyes held something that Colonel Webb's camera crew couldn't capture, and his character assassination couldn't destroy: absolute certainty in what she had witnessed. Outside the building, Sarah pulled out her personal phone and dialed a number she had memorized but never thought she would use. It was the number for investigative journalist David Park, who specialized in military corruption cases. She had researched him months ago, just in case. "Mr. Park? This is Lieutenant Sarah Chen. I think you're going to want to hear what I have to say about SEAL Team 6. The conversation that followed would set in motion a chain of events that would eventually expose one of the biggest military scandals in recent history. But Sarah didn't know that yet. All she knew was that she had taken the first step on a path that would either vindicate her completely or destroy her utterly. As she drove away from the base that had been her home for 3 years, Sarah thought about Jake Morrison and his team. She thought about what they had done in Afghanistan and what they were still doing. She thought about the families who would never know what really happened to their loved ones. And she thought about Colonel Webb's words: "The truth has a way of coming out." He was right about that. He just didn't realize which truth was about to surface. David Park had seen many military whistleblowers over his 15-year career as an investigative journalist, but Sarah Chen was different. She didn't want money, fame, or revenge. She wanted justice, and that made her dangerous to the wrong people and valuable to the right ones. 3 weeks after their initial phone conversation, David sat across from Sarah in a small coffee shop in downtown Portland, Oregon, far from any military installation. Sarah had been officially discharged from the Army, her benefits stripped, her reputation destroyed. But she carried herself with the same military bearing that had served her well as an intelligence officer. "Tell me about Jake Morrison," David said, his digital recorder sitting between them on the scratched wooden table. Sarah's jaw tightened slightly. "Jake was my partner during Operation Silent Thunder. We were embedded with his SEAL unit for a 3-month deployment in eastern Afghanistan. Our mission was to gather intelligence on Taliban supply routes and weapons caches. But that's not all they were doing." "No." Sarah stared out the coffee shop window at the rain falling on the busy street. 3 weeks into the deployment, Jake's team received what they called special orders. Orders that didn't go through normal command channels. Orders that didn't have proper documentation. David leaned forward. He had learned that the most important information often came in these quiet moments, when sources were deciding whether to trust him completely. "The orders came directly from someone calling himself Overlord," Sarah continued. "We never found out who Overlord was, but Jake treated these communications like gospel. The team started conducting night raids on compounds that weren't on any official target list." "What kind of compounds?" Sarah's hands clenched around her coffee cup. "They said they were Taliban strongholds. But the intelligence didn't match. These were small villages, family compounds, places with more children than fighters." David had covered enough military operations to know where this was heading, but he needed Sarah to tell her story without leading her. "What did you observe during these raids?" "The first one was on March 8th. Jake's team hit a compound outside Jalalabad. According to their after-action report, they encountered heavy resistance and eliminated 6 enemy combatants. No American casualties. But you saw something different." Sarah nodded, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I was monitoring communications from our forward operating base. I heard the entire operation in real time. There was no resistance, David. These people were sleeping when the team breached the compound. I heard women screaming, children crying, Jake ordering his men to clean up the mess." David felt the familiar chill he experienced when a story moved from suspicious to criminal. "Did you report what you heard?" "I tried. I went to Jake immediately after the team returned. He told me there had been a communication malfunction and that I had misunderstood what happened. He said the official report was accurate and that discussing the operation with anyone else would violate operational security." "But you didn't accept that explanation." Sarah shook her head. "I couldn't. 2 days later, I found a way to access the compound. There were no signs of a firefight, David. No bullet holes in walls, no evidence of weapons or explosives. But there were bloodstains in what looked like sleeping areas. Family photos scattered on the floor. Children's toys covered in blood. David made notes, but part of his attention was focused on watching Sarah's face as she relived these memories. He could see the toll this had taken on her, but he could also see the steel underneath her pain. I started documenting everything after that, Sarah continued. Jake's team conducted 7 more raids over the next 2 months. Each time, the official reports described enemy combatants eliminated. Each time, my intelligence suggested we were hitting civilian targets. Did you ever confront Morrison directly about what you suspected? Once. After the raid on April 15th. That one was different because I was actually present when they received their orders. Sarah's voice took on a harder edge. I heard Overlord personally give Jake coordinates for a target described as a high-value weapons cache. But, when I cross-referenced those coordinates with our intelligence databases, they pointed to a school. David looked up from his notes. A school? A girls' school that had been closed by the Taliban but was being secretly operated by a local women's rights group. When I told Jake what I had found, he became angry. He said I was interfering with special operations beyond my clearance level. He ordered me to delete my research and never mention it again. Did you? I deleted it from my official systems, but I kept copies on a personal device. I also started recording conversations whenever possible. David felt his pulse quicken. Physical evidence was the holy grail of investigative journalism, especially in military stories where most sources eventually disappeared or changed their stories under pressure. What happened during the school raid? Sarah was quiet for so long that David wondered if she had decided not to answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. Jake's team hit the compound at 3 a.m. According to their report, they eliminated 12 enemy combatants and seized a significant weapons cache. No American casualties. And the reality? I monitored the entire operation. What I heard. Sarah stopped and took a shaky breath. I heard Jake's team breach a building where people were sleeping. I heard automatic weapons fire that lasted for over 2 minutes. I heard Jake radio that the target was clean and to sanitize the area. Meaning? Meaning they were destroying evidence and creating a cover story. When the team returned, they brought back a few old AK-47s and some homemade explosives that could have come from anywhere. But, David, I saw the casualty reports from the local hospital. 17 civilians were killed that night, including 8 children. The oldest victim was a 60-year-old woman who had been teaching girls to read. David set down his pen and looked directly at Sarah. This is why you reported them. This is why I tried to report them. But, when I submitted my intelligence assessment, it disappeared from the system within 24 hours. When I asked my commanding officer about it, he said there was no record of any report. When I went to Jake directly, he denied everything and suggested I might be suffering from combat stress. So you documented everything you could remember and submitted a new report when you returned stateside? Yes. But, by then, Jake's team had been rotated back to the States as well. They had time to coordinate their stories, destroy evidence, and prepare their defense. David leaned back in his chair, processing the scope of what Sarah was describing. How many people do you think knew what was really happening? Jake's entire 6-man team, obviously. Their commanding officer, Commander Patricia Hayes, had to know something was wrong with the mission reports. And, whoever Overlord was, he was giving the orders. Any theories about Overlord's identity? Sarah hesitated. I have suspicions, but nothing I can prove. The communications equipment Jake used for Overlord conversations was special gear that only senior officers have access to. And, the targets they were hitting, they weren't random. Someone with access to high-level intelligence was selecting these compounds. Someone who wanted specific people dead. That's what I think, yes. But, I could never figure out the pattern. Why a girls' school? Why peaceful family compounds? What was the strategic value? David had some theories about that, but he needed to verify Sarah's story before he could pursue them. Do you still have the recordings you made? Sarah pulled a small device from her purse. Everything's on here. Conversations with Jake, audio from the raids, my own notes and observations. I've kept it hidden since my discharge. Why haven't you taken this to the FBI or the military's Criminal Investigation Command? Because Colonel Webb made it very clear what would happen if I continued pursuing this. He told me that my mental health records would be leaked, that I would be painted as an unstable veteran who couldn't handle combat stress. He said no one would believe me, and that I would spend the rest of my life fighting false accusations. David nodded. He had seen this playbook before. But, you're willing to risk that now? I'm willing to risk that because I realized something after my discharge. This isn't just about what Jake's team did in Afghanistan. If Overlord is still operating, if this network is still active, then more people are dying. American soldiers are being used to commit war crimes, and the victims will never get justice unless someone speaks up. David spent the next 3 hours listening to the recordings on Sarah's device. What he heard confirmed her story in chilling detail. Jake Morrison's voice discussing cleaning up loose ends. Radio chatter about eliminating witnesses. Post-operation conversations about ensuring operational security through intimidation and cover-ups. But the most damning evidence was a recorded conversation between Jake and an unknown voice that Sarah had identified as Overlord. In it, Overlord gave explicit orders to eliminate problematic civilians who had been interfering with American interests. The voice was disguised through electronic modification, but the authority was unmistakable. As David prepared to leave the coffee shop, he made Sarah a promise that would change both their lives. I'm going to expose this, he told her. But I need you to know that once this story breaks, there's no going back. These people have already tried to destroy you once. When they realize you've gone public, they're going to come after you with everything they have. Sarah stood up and shook his hand with the firm grip of someone who had made peace with the consequences of her choices. David, they've already taken everything I worked for. My career, my reputation, my benefits, my future. The only thing I have left is the truth. They can't take that away from me. As Sarah walked away, David watched her disappear into the Portland crowd. He didn't know it yet, but within 6 weeks, his investigation would uncover a network of corruption that reached from Afghanistan to the Pentagon. Sarah's recordings would lead to a congressional investigation, multiple criminal indictments, and the exposure of one of the most systematic abuse scandals in modern military history. But first, he had to find out who Overlord really was. And that search would reveal connections that went far deeper than anyone had imagined. 6 months after David Park's first meeting with Sarah Chen, the story that would reshape public understanding of military accountability was finally ready for publication. But the path to that moment had been filled with dangers that neither journalist nor source had fully anticipated. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. While David was following leads about Overlord's identity, Sarah received a phone call that changed everything. The caller was Sergeant Marcus Williams, a former member of Jake Morrison's SEAL team who had been struggling with what he had witnessed in Afghanistan. "Ma'am, I heard about what happened to you," Williams said, his voice shaking during their recorded conversation. "I've been carrying this guilt for 2 years, and I can't do it anymore. What we did over there, it wasn't right. Lieutenant Morrison wasn't the only one giving orders. There was someone else, someone high up who was using our unit for personal business." Williams agreed to meet with David and Sarah at a secure location. What he revealed confirmed Sarah's worst suspicions and added details that made the scandal even more explosive. Overlord wasn't some mysterious intelligence contact, Williams explained as he sat across from them in a rented hotel room. Overlord was Brigadier General Thomas Harwick, the deputy commander of special operations in Afghanistan. He was using our unit to eliminate people who were interfering with his business interests. David looked up from his notes. Business interests? General Harwick had partnerships with private security contractors who were trying to establish operations in eastern Afghanistan. The problem was, local leaders and community organizers kept exposing their illegal activities. The girls' school that we hit? The teacher there had been documenting human rights abuses by Harwick's contractor friends. The family compounds we raided? They were home to tribal elders who refused to cooperate with Harwick's business deals. Sarah felt sick to her stomach. So we weren't conducting counter-terrorism operations. We were performing assassinations for a corrupt general's business partners. Williams nodded miserably. Every target Overlord gave us was someone who threatened his money. When Lieutenant Morrison realized what was happening, he tried to refuse the orders. That's when General Harwick threatened to court-martial the entire team for the operations we had already conducted. He said we were in too deep to back out. Why didn't you report this? David asked. To who? Harwick was our commanding authority. He controlled our communications, our mission reports, everything. And he made it clear that if anyone talked, he would ensure we were all charged with war crimes while he walked away clean. Williams pulled out a flash drive and set it on the table. But I kept records. Communications logs, mission briefings, financial documents I found in Harwick's personal files. I've been waiting for someone brave enough to use them. David examined the flash drive with trembling hands. If Williams was telling the truth, this contained evidence of systematic war crimes orchestrated by a general officer for personal profit. Over the next 3 weeks, David worked with a team of military law experts and forensic accountants to verify Williams' evidence. What they found was breathtaking in its scope and audacity. General Harwick had received over $2 million in consulting fees from private military contractors between 2019 and 2021. In exchange, he used SEAL Team 6 to eliminate local opposition to their operations. The victims weren't enemy combatants, they were teachers, community leaders, women's rights activists, and tribal elders who stood in the way of contractor profits. But the evidence also revealed something that made Sarah's original treatment even more outrageous. Colonel Webb hadn't just been protecting the SEAL team, he had been protecting General Harwick. Webb was scheduled for promotion to Brigadier General, and Harwick had promised to support that promotion in exchange for Webb's help covering up the scandal. The week before David's story was scheduled to publish, Sarah received an unexpected visitor at her apartment. Jake Morrison stood on her doorstep, looking nothing like the confident SEAL leader she remembered from Afghanistan. Sarah, I need to talk to you, he said, his usual commanding presence replaced by obvious desperation. Against her better judgment, Sarah let him inside. What followed was a conversation that provided the final pieces of the puzzle. You were right about everything, Jake said, slumping into her living room chair. We weren't conducting legitimate operations. Harwick was using us to commit murder, and I let it happen because I was scared of losing my career. Jake, 17 children died because you followed illegal orders. I know. Jake's voice broke. I've been living with that for 2 years. Every night, I see their faces. My wife left me because I couldn't handle the nightmares. My kids won't talk to me because I became someone they didn't recognize. Sarah felt a mixture of anger and pity looking at the broken man sitting in her apartment. Then, why did you let them destroy my career? Why didn't you back me up when I tried to report what happened? Because I was a coward. Harwick promised that if we all stayed quiet, the whole thing would disappear. He said you were a weak link who couldn't handle the pressure of special operations. He convinced me that destroying your credibility was the only way to protect the team. Jake reached into his jacket and pulled out a sealed envelope. But I can't live with this anymore. That envelope contains my complete confession. Everything I did, everything Harwick ordered, everything Webb helped cover up. I'm going to turn myself in to the FBI tomorrow, but I wanted you to have this first. Why now? Sarah asked. Because I found out that Harwick is still operating. He's been transferred to a new command, and he's using different units the same way he used us. More people are dying because I didn't have the courage to stop him 2 years ago. Jake stood up to leave, then turned back to Sarah one final time. I know this doesn't fix what happened to you. I know it doesn't bring back the people we killed. But I hope it helps you get some justice." After Jake left, Sarah called David immediately. Jake's confession provided the final validation they needed, along with evidence of ongoing criminal activity that would make the story impossible to ignore. David's article was published 3 days later in a major national newspaper. The headline read, "Decorated General Used Elite SEAL Unit for Personal Profit, Systematic War Crimes Covered Up by Military Leadership." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, the story was being covered by every major news outlet in the country. By the end of the first day, congressional leaders were calling for emergency hearings. By the end of the first week, the FBI had opened a criminal investigation. General Harwick was arrested at his home in Virginia on charges of conspiracy, murder for hire, corruption, and war crimes. Colonel Webb was arrested the same day on charges of conspiracy and obstruction of justice. Jake Morrison turned himself in as promised and became a cooperating witness in exchange for a reduced sentence. The congressional hearings that followed lasted 6 months and revealed the full scope of military corruption in Afghanistan. Sarah testified before Congress, finally, able to tell her story without fear of retaliation. Her testimony was broadcast live on national television, and public opinion quickly shifted from seeing her as a troubled whistleblower to recognizing her as a hero who had sacrificed everything to expose the truth. But the most meaningful moment came during a private meeting with the families of the Afghan victims. Through an international human rights organization, Sarah was able to speak with relatives of the people killed during the illegal operations. She couldn't bring their loved ones back, but she could ensure that the world knew their names and their stories. The aftermath brought both justice and personal redemption for Sarah. General Harwick was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Colonel Webb received 25 years. Jake Morrison, as a cooperating witness, received 15 years but would be eligible for parole in 7. Sarah received a formal apology from the Secretary of Defense and was offered full restoration of her military benefits and rank. She declined the offer to return to active duty, instead choosing to work with veterans organizations to support other military whistleblowers. 2 years after her discharge, Sarah stood before a packed auditorium at Georgetown University, delivering a speech about the importance of moral courage in military service. "People ask me if I regret speaking out," she said, looking out at the audience of military officers, students, and journalists. "They ask if I think it was worth losing my career to expose the truth. My answer is always the same: I didn't lose my career by speaking out. I would have lost my soul by staying silent." In the front row, David Park smiled as he took notes for his follow-up story about the long-term impact of the scandal. Beside him sat Marcus Williams, who had received a reduced sentence in exchange for his cooperation and was now working with Sarah to reform military accountability procedures. "The military taught me that honor is not about following orders blindly," Sarah continued. "Honor is about doing what's right, even when it costs you everything. The 17 innocent people who died in Afghanistan will never be forgotten. Their sacrifice gave meaning to our struggle for truth and justice." After her speech, Sarah was approached by a young Army lieutenant who reminded her of herself several years earlier, dedicated, idealistic, and troubled by what she had witnessed during her deployment. "Ma'am, I think I need to report something about my commanding officer," the lieutenant said quietly. "But I'm scared about what will happen to my career." Sarah put her hand on the young officer's shoulder and smiled. "Let me tell you something I've learned: your career will recover from doing the right thing. Your conscience never recovers from staying silent." As they walked out of the auditorium together, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The path from that sterile conference room where Colonel Webb had tried to destroy her to this auditorium where she was inspiring the next generation of ethical military leaders had been longer and more difficult than she could have imagined. But every step had been worth it. The truth had finally come out, and it had changed everything for everyone involved. Justice had been served, lives had been saved, and the military was slowly learning that accountability was not a threat to good order and discipline, it was the foundation of it. And somewhere in Afghanistan, in small villages where families had lost loved ones to corruption and greed, people knew that someone had cared enough to risk everything to tell their story. In the end, that knowledge made all the sacrifice worthwhile.